A lot of leaders come to me and they say, hey, my team doesn't talk to me. Or when I send a request or when I send an idea, there's no reply. Like I have to go hunt them down. And that feels like micromanagement. And then they feel guilty about micromanaging their people. Or worse, the leader might attribute that sense of they don't have any feedback to me as a show of lack of competence, where really what they get wrong in such situations is that it's a lack of commitment and a lack of reciprocation to the commitment, right? And usually this happens in feature factories where teams are just spread too thin. There's too many people working on too many different things, and then you need reports on where we're headed, and really it just dilutes attention, there's no focus, and then nobody really gets to feel proud about what they're working on, because the company doesn't care about most things that you're working on. Because the company usually cares about one large thing out of 100. And it's important to be able to help people connect to that. And when you don't, you get these sort of this detachment, silence, apathy, or people are glad the day went by rather than being actively engaged in the process of building a product.
I saw a shift towards creating these feature factories. I think you mentioned the feature factory already. It's this typical ticket-driven development which has sneaked into our industry. And I think that's one of the main core reasons. There's this gap between business and development, which is today more like a management practice. It is like an ideal. It is like you need to make and develop exchangeable. You need to keep the process lean. You need to have good KPIs. You need to have good measurement times of people working towards goal, burn down charts. That was a drive, I think Java and other platforms that were partly responsible for that movement as well. And I really dislike it because it creates an environment where people become silent, where people think that I shouldn't speak up too loud. I just need to get my stuff done and don't really need to improve myself because there is not much room to improve myself. I just get my things done and then I'm good. If I open too many cases here, if I speak up too loud, I might run into trouble. And I'm not feeling that I'm in right trouble because most developers I personally know start to accept the situation as it is, don't want to change anything about that, and adopt ways to cope with it instead of actually making a change. The ownership idea is very hard to understand. Ownership bottom up is still a diffuse concept for many teams out there. It's like, how can we change something bottom up? What is bottom up actually? I found for myself that I was so in the tunnel of understanding these issues that it felt strange for me if someone else don't. In recent years, I have worked together with a lot of people who know exactly about that. And now I'm working again with people who don't really know about that. It represents, I think, most of the people out there don't really understand how they can change something. So you have some power to change something bottom up, but you need to do something top down as well. So this is both is very important.
Engineering managers and CTOs often get wrong the line in the sand about when it's time to step in, right? Because if we have a established process, or if we want to introduce a process, if an engineer willingly abstains from, and you communicate it clearly that it's not optional, then we need to step in day one, not wait a week and see if it improves, not wait a month and see if it improves.
Yeah.
So a lot of leaders struggle with like playing bad cop, right? And they might cope or hope, right? They hope, they cope or hope. They hope it'll improve, or they hope they don't have. Because really, what are they doing, right? Leaders are avoiding to have that hard conversation with their employee where they're giving them bad feedback and potentially have to pip them or fire them because they don't want to be the guy who tells them they need to go look for another job in this economy. Avoiding it, they're spreading out. What they're doing is they are pouring fuel onto the fire, and they are basically giving their silent blessing for that behavior, and then that behavior starts to spread. Some leaders that I'm coaching, we often have this venting session. I ask them what keeps them up at night, and they just dump everything. This bothers me and that bothers me. And then usually we get into this thought pattern, this speech pattern, looking for problems, and it standardizes into a feedback or analysis of, I don't like how this engineer handled the situation. And I usually pause at that and say, is there a playbook how they should be handling it? Or do they need to discover how to handle it? And usually the answer is, oh, no, they should have done X, Y, and Z. Okay, do they know that? And if not, tell them. And if you told them and they still don't do it, I got bad news. Maybe that person is not competent to be in this role. Or maybe the behavior that you want from them requires first a conversation about a promotion, because it is, then we need to frame it as, hang on, is that a senior engineer who you want to be a tech lead? And now you're teaching them to be a tech lead without even bringing up the topic of promoting them? Or is this a tech lead who acts like a mid-level engineer and you're treating them like a mid-level engineer rather than treating them like a tech lead who is underperforming? We need to simplify the conversation down because these frames are very important. We need to know ultimately whether you're happy to work with somebody and you want to give them growth opportunities, or whether they're not performing. And you're basically helping them catch up with how they're neglecting their duties, but you never let them fail. And you never give them feedback, and you never give them support when they fail. I had a situation recently where we had to let somebody go. So I advised a leader, and ultimately we had to let somebody go. Sorry. So this is a leader who struggled giving negative feedback, right? So it felt like they brought me in to proxy the negative feedback, right? And what I did, I said, look, you didn't give me the authority to fire him, so I won't pip this person, right? You have HR for that. You also need to really protect yourself. I can just come in and share private details about our conversations, right? But then what I did share with him was that this employee with whom you're not competent, but their commitment of, hey, we had some tough times. Would you like to continue working here? Because that entails fixing some behaviors. And if they say no, that's not because they're not competent, but maybe they actually have, maybe they just didn't pass the vibe check, the culture check. Maybe they actually have a preference to go work somewhere else. Or maybe they already have an offer. But that is always the preferred way. And it's very easy to test, right? Another leader did this was some time ago as a test to me about how I would handle a situation. Coach, like how I would advise. And a CTO of a company, a CTO who is also co-founder, I think that's important, was telling me, look, this is my worst team. What should I do about them? And he gave me this analysis, the client, the project. And my response to them was, A, why are you investing into your worst team? What does the best team look like? Right? What's the difference? Is it like 10% better, or is it like a huge difference? That was my first question. My second question was, in response to that analysis, was, do they know you consider them their worst team? Do they know? Do the other teams know?
People very often avoid this as leaders to actually face their challenges.
Yes.
When they see an obstacle, they basically take the other route and then they try to sit it out, hope for the better. And on some point in time, they then do this hard play push because it is already too late to fix something. And often people don't see that.
Yes.
If you really give the team a chance, first of all, to be a team, not isolating each other. I have it basically in every mentoring I have with a tech lead since years. Is the talk about these things, 50% or more of the team doesn't know what the fuck you're talking about.
And also the leaders aren't aware that this isolation, this separation is self-imposed, that they actually want it. So for example, with this client that gave me this test, there's a reason why I asked these questions. Do they know? Because I was about to propose that their worst people spend more time with their best people to learn from them, right? Because why not? And his reaction was immediately, no, my best people are working on an important project. I don't want this team to bother them, to interrupt them. And that creates a really weird sort of closeted conversation where very important considerations about authority and influence and leadership and respect get flattened out into this, common denominator. And the common denominator is your relationship with the people you're unhappy with as a leader, right? So everybody in the company you treat exactly the same, which is to say you treat them as you would treat somebody that you're unhappy with. So there's constantly this negativity in the air rather than praising your best people, right?
My biggest issue I saw in life for myself was my ego. And I see the very same patterns in so many people, basically all people. So ego is a huge fundamental human condition problem. And it is like people praise these kind of situations to avoid really facing, like standing and saying, no, I think you should change. I think there's something wrong. That is such an obstacle for people to confront people and say, I am not happy with your performance. Instead, we wait for performance meetings, which often come from HR or very far away, that you can say, HR told me that. And then you are more the messenger than the actual leader, which I call that proxy manager, not leader. But there are two worlds. And I think that is a totally misunderstood thing when developers and tech leads treat like we are engineering and that's it. So we are like, we have an engineering world. Our goals, fulfilling the ticket system, making business people happy, like people, like project manager, whoever is there. And there are two worlds, and I would like to talk about more in specific how this thinking of separation, so separating away the engineering from the business, actually affects this main topic, like developers are silent. No, you ignore them from the business perspective. Many businesses treat developers as a necessity, and that's a lot connected with the AI replacing staff. That's basically where it comes from, because if people wouldn't have, that wouldn't be a topic of its own at all. And I think that's one of the biggest thing we should learn about, is that engineering, especially in SaaS companies and these kind of things, are the core of the company, not some department on the right side, on the left side, and you can treat them like something you need to maintain somehow, and you need to employ some people who manage this because it's so annoying, developers. If you have that kind of mindset, you have already lost, because you make it nearly impossible for the engineers to get closer to you because you separate them. That's a top-down issue right now. What do you think about that?
I often see engineers being mistreated as a tool or as a operator of a call center or as a cog in a feature factory, right? The best teams that I coached and worked with, engineers were treated as strategic business partners. So they weren't looked at as you are the organic thing of this deployment pipeline or this SDLC, but you are actually here sitting down with us, deciding what goes to our customers, talking to our customers, representing the company in front of our customers, right? So that there wasn't this sort of dehumanizing stance of, oh, if it's a product decision, it has to be from a product person. And if it's an engineering decision, it has to be from an engineer, right?
And you're like, oh, I don't understand why this gets better. So I have no clue. And I think that was triggering me a little bit, because I think that became my main job in teams, to try to break this apart. And when you start talking about that, people look at you like, don't understand what you're talking about there. I have that in German teams, I have that in UK teams, and I had even had that in American teams, even though in American teams it's not that common, because ownership is a different thing there. But here in Europe, you have still this old mentality of, you need to listen to your boss.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing coming, you don't say anything.
Committees are the death of every company.
It's absolutely brutal.
What engineering leaders get wrong about ownership is that ownership has to do with your ability to autonomously make decisions. Ownership isn't that you run the meeting and then you present your opinion to 7 people and then we vote and then the highest paid person wins. That's not ownership. Ownership has to do with, I make the decision and don't need to explain myself to you. Now, if my decision was bad for the business, we still need to have a conversation. But the point isn't that then after one mistake, you take ownership away from me. So most leaders show up that they are working in such environments. What they did was they give one person ownership, and that person was not competent enough. And they were in culture where there's no talk about underperformers. Anybody who asks for help immediately labels themselves, by contrast, as being an underperformer.
Yes, that's the issue.
And that's why then developers stay silent, right? If you said,
I don't want to be the first person raising hand and being shot at, right?
Exactly. So if you as a leader show up as, hey, I need help with this, I don't know how to do this, I need your help, you show them an example of how to ask your help without adopting that label. So that's number one, you can model it. Number two, you can tell an underperformer that he's underperforming and that you expect them from now on to get help. And you can call it out. You can call it out and say, hey, you had some rough times with the designing that feature. From now on, I would like you to check in with this other developer about how to improve that, how to avoid that. he built something similar. Why don't you learn from him? And then you give the other person direction. Hey, I expect you guys to work together closely on this and provide each other for support. And I'll be checking in with you guys about how that's going. So that's very helpful. What's not helpful is to then be hush-hush and do this privately and be constantly worried that somebody will be offended. They'll be offended when you fire them. They'll be offended when you let them go because your company runs out of money, right? It's a business. There isn't anything, this coping and hoping strategy of let's just ignore it out by osmosis. That's never going to happen because all it does.
I really like to have that as a team responsibility to point out performance internally and make sure they are not underperforming anymore. So that can be a task without blaming from outside. So the tech lead above the team, or however you want to call it, doesn't need to point out a person in public. You can just say the team is underperforming. Please do something about that. For that, you basically have team leads. Yes. Team leads are supposed to keep that private and make sure that the baseline is kept. And if the baseline is not, if you're constantly underperforming, even though the team knows about it's underperforming, then you shouldn't have any problem pointing that out again and making consequences. Consequences are often something which doesn't happen until the consequences someone needs to leave or someone leaves, as you said. And this is what I personally absolutely dislike, that is Seneca, to have a little bit of stoicism here right now, Seneca said, if you protect the wicked, you harm the good. And that is exactly what happens here. You cannot simply protect the people who not doing well, even though they have a contract, and expect everyone else did, because on some point you punish the people who are actually doing good and suddenly lose colleagues, don't really get that, or are so frustrated that they think they need to go because they cannot speak up because no one is talking about problems.
When you get this effect in your company where your developers don't want to talk to you, especially when your best developers don't want to talk to you, it's usually because you lost your best engineers, your best people's respect, or when you lost their commitment. They are no longer excited to work for you or to work on your projects. They're just coming in to get a paycheck. This impulse to be satisfied or dissatisfied based on some kind of level of influence, based on some kind of respect, is the primary tribal drive that allows good teams, great teams, elite teams to flourish. This is what you need to nurture. This is what we mean by engineering culture.